So I've just seen Tenet, and after watching it, I thought I'd go ahead and make an explainer video trying to break down the plot of this movie and explain it for some of the people out there that are a little bit confused. Because I did come out of this movie, I thought I got it all, but then I had to spend a bit of time on Reddit and reading what other people were saying to really wrap my head around what actually happened in totality. This movie was extremely heady, and I don't think we'd expect anything less from Christopher Nolan, especially because he loves to whip out these high-level concepts and really thought-provoking themes. And this movie is sort of like a parallel to Inception. Whereas Inception was dealing with dreams and the human mind, this movie is dealing with time. And whenever a movie tries to tackle the concept of time, it just gets really messy and really complex. And I must say, as a general comment, and I've read so many people feel this way, the sound mixing of this film was not quite up to par. The sound was very hard to hear at a lot of points in the film. There was a lot of muffled mumbling and a lot of, masks being worn and dialogue through masks. You couldn't see their mouths. You couldn't even guess what they were trying to say. So because of that, and obviously not having subtitles in the cinema, it really made it hard to interpret and understand a lot of the dialogue that was being told. And in that dialogue, of course, there's going to be nuggets of information that are key to the plot of the movie. And if you miss that, then, well, maybe you get a bit lost. So if you are confused because you did have a bit of difficulty hearing in the film, you are not alone, and you've come to the right place, because in this video I'm going to try and explain the plot of the movie in its entirety and hopefully clear some of those things up. So a big warning, if you have not seen Christopher Nolan's new film Tenet, this video is definitely gonna spoil all of it for you. So if you haven't seen it and you want to see it and you don't want it spoiled, you better click away from this video. But if you don't care, or you've already seen the movie and you don't get it, then just keep watching. So we start with a protagonist who is played by John David Washington. He is Denzel Washington's son, but he's trying to make a name for himself in Hollywood. He had a breakout performance in Spike Lee's Black Klansman, and before that he was in that HBO show with The Rock, Ballers. Anyway, we start with him. He's part of this American squad that are teaming up with these Ukrainians, and they're sent into the opera to extract this American VIP. His team put on these patches that blend them in with the local police, and they sort of blend in with the response unit and go to find this individual. For an opening, this was extremely exhilarating from the very beginning. The very first sounds you hear are just the musicians tuning their instruments, their violins, their cellos, and that sound itself, it just built so much tension. And as soon as the terrorists attack, smashing everything, the music was just pumping, and the energy level was just insane from the get-go. The police and the SWAT teams pump in some sort of gas that puts everyone to sleep, so all the civilians get knocked out, but the terrorists are prepared, so they've all got masks. The protagonist and his team, they punch through all the rooms in the boxes and the suites until they find the man they're looking for. And then the protagonist says to the VIP the line, "We live in a twilight world," and gets the response, "And there are no friends at dusk." What does this mean? Well, I'm not gonna lie, I don't know. And I don't think this movie really explain this line in particular. It was used quite a few times. It was basically a code that was communicated throughout the movie. Sator, the antagonist, actually uses this line as well, and it's not quite clear where this line is actually coming from. So yeah, there's actually something I'm not too sure about. Anyway, the VIP tells the protagonist that he's made contact and that the item he received is in the code check. So the protagonist rushes over there and he's getting shot at, and he finds the item, and it's like this chunky metal piece, and he doesn't know what it is. Not a bomb or anything, it's just a metal piece. The team regroup and they swap out the VIP member for one of the protagonist's team member, and the VIP is taken out some back exit. And meanwhile, the protagonist and his teammate, now disguised as the VIP, go back to remove the bombs. And this is the very first instance of the protagonist's humanity. They do mention that, saving the civilians isn't part of the mission, but he doesn't care and he goes ahead and tries to save them anyways. But as he goes to remove one of the bombs, he sort of gets caught out, them realizing that he's not actually part of the police team, and a gun gets pointed at his head, but subsequently that guy is shot by what we find out later is an inverted bullet. The protagonist gathers all the bombs and he chucks them all in the nosebleeds, and him and his teammate make a run for it, running outside the opera house, and you see an awesome explosion in the background. They run back to the van with the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians realize that the VIP is not the person that they wanted, and they end up torturing the protagonist and his teammate, pulling out all of the protagonist's teeth. But before giving up any information, the protagonist manages to swallow a cyanide pill being held out by his teammate, and he supposedly dies. However, of course, the movie can't end there. He doesn't die, he wakes up and he's greeted by some senior CIA looking guy and he welcomes him to the afterlife. And understandably, the protagonist is pretty confused. He thought that that pill was meant to kill him and he was doing it in order to protect his team. But the senior CIA guy just tells him that the events that occurred at the opera house were actually part of something much bigger than he realized. But him taking that cyanide pill and essentially sacrificing his life was essentially a test to let him into this group called the Tenet. And literally without explaining much else to him, he tells him that by using the word Tenet and this sign, he should be able to open some doors, some good and some bad. And then he sends him off on his way. And then the protagonist just chills out on this wind farm, I think, just doing these push-ups and chin-ups. Not sure how long he's out there for, but eventually they end up going back to the mainland. But as soon as he gets off the boat, a guy pops out of a car and he knows instinctively to just get in the car, and conveniently there are some GPS coordinates and he follows those GPS coordinates and it brings him to a university where he meets the scientist Laura. She shows him that some objects have been inverted, meaning that their entropy is reversed somewhere in the future and now they actually move backwards in time. Now, I must admit, the explanation in this part of the film is pretty rubbish. And even Laura says at one point, like, don't think about it too much, don't try and understand it. But I mean, that's the whole point. We want to understand the concepts and follow on, but it sort of is glossed over a little bit as something you just have to accept. Like, these things can go backwards. I found it quite hard to accept what she was saying. She was saying essentially, oh, you would have dropped that bullet, but now because it's going backwards, you're actually catching it. But he never did drop that bullet, so I don't understand how it can go backwards into his hand. Whatever, it's just something you have to accept. She tells the protagonist that these inverted objects are suggesting that in the future there's going to be a World War III-like event, and that in order to prevent this, he needs to find out who's actually manufacturing these inverted objects and why. So deducing from the materials of the bullet, the protagonist heads to Mumbai to talk to an Indian arms dealer who has a monopoly over the weapons in that region, and he's the only one that would supply bullets with this makeup. He gives someone a call, I'm not sure who it is, but he asks for an assist and they send Neil, a British agent played by Robert Pattinson. So the two of them, they break into the home of the arms dealer by essentially slingshotting themselves up a building and taking out the guards. The protagonist, he manages to find the arms dealer, he's got a gun to his head, and he threatens him and questions him about the inverted bullets. The arms dealer is not compliant. He claims he doesn't know what he's talking about and that he doesn't know anything about any inversion of any bullets, but then his wife, Priya, comes out and uses the word Tenet and the hand signal, and the protagonist realizes that she's the one he needs to be talking to. She goes on to explain that the inverted bullets are used and dealt by a Russian oligarch by the name of Andrei Sator, who's played by Kenneth Branagh. So the movie's already going at a rapid pace and it just keeps chugging forward. We go back to London where the protagonist meets with a Michael Crosby played by Michael Keane, and he is part of the British intelligence. It's really unclear as to why he has this contact or why he knows that this guy can get him in with Sator and why this guy would even help him. But whatever, another leap of logic, it's fine. I did find this scene a little bit odd because they were talking so quickly and they were talking so smoothly. They were just spitting out these really witty one-liners, one after another, just having these jabs, and it was like poetry. It was like Shakespeare, but it just didn't feel right for me because it felt like, you know, the protagonist would be a bit confused. He's trying to work out what's going on, but he felt so in control in that scene. It just felt a bit out of whack and a bit out of character at that point in the film. Anyway, Michael Keane's character provides the protagonist with the information he needs, and he gives him this fake drawing of which Sator also has a fake version of. I'm not super sure why this is relevant to getting an in with Sator, just having the same fake painting. I guess it's meant to be that Sator is under the impression that he's got the real one, and if you come up with another one, he's gonna be like, wait, what's going on here? Why are there two of the same ones, I guess? The protagonist brings the fake drawing to Sator's wife, Kat, played by Elizabeth Debicki, who works at a London auction house. She ends up going to dinner with the protagonist and explains that she actually sold that drawing to Sator for a couple $1 million. And she didn't realize that it was fake. And because it's fake, he's been using that to blackmail her by threatening her career, or essentially threatening to put her in jail for selling a forgery for millions of dollars. So essentially she's forced to do whatever Sator wants, and she is kept under Sator's lock and key. But as she reiterates, and she reiterates so many times throughout the film, she is willing to put up with Sator if it means that she can be with her son, Max. So the protagonist offers to solve her issue with Sator if she can get him a meeting. And at this point, a whole bunch of Russian thugs just rock up and they escort Kat out of the building, and they plan to gang up and beat up the protagonist. But in the end, they all end up getting smoked by him. The choreography in action in this kitchen fight scene is absolutely amazing. It's just so brutal and guttural, and I mean, I thought this fight scene itself was worth the price of admission. So the protagonist rocks up at Max's school and he has another chat with Kat. And Kat tells him about Sator's art dealings and how he brings imports in through what's called a freeport at the Oslo airport. So understanding that Sator doesn't really care about art and yet highly values these freeports, the protagonist and Neil deduce that Sator must be hiding something important at the freeport. And so Neil goes ahead and scouts out the freeport and learns that in an event of a fire or a lockdown, oxygen is sucked out of the rooms, but some of the doors remain unlocked. So Neil suggests that they crash a jet into the freeport to cause this lockdown and to cause a fire to allow them to break into the freeport and find out what Sator is hiding. Neil brings in his mate Mahir to be in charge of the plane crashing, while Neil and the protagonist break into the freeport. And while crashing the plane, Mahir and his accomplice, they drop these gold bars out of the plane as well, trying to hide the fact that they were crashing the plane into the freeport to get access to the freeport and making it look like they were actually hijacking the plane for the gold. So anyway, the plane crashes into the freeport, the oxygen gets sucked out, the tour guide that was giving the protagonist and Neil a tour, he quickly turns on the jets and gets out of there, leaving Neil and the protagonist to hold their breath and make their way through the rooms. And they eventually make their way into the middle of the freeport, where they find two separate rooms separated by a glass door with two revolving doors sitting on either side. A man in a SWAT uniform pops out of both sides. On Neil's side, he pushes past Neil and tries to make a run for it, but on the protagonist's side, they enter into a full-blown fight, except all of his moves are inverted. So this fight is super trippy. You can see the physics at play. The way that the inverted guy moves is in reverse, and the way that the protagonist moves is going forward. The protagonist eventually gains the upper hand, but before he's able to finish off the guy in the SWAT uniform, he's seemingly sucked out of a small opening and disappears. Neil pulls the protagonist away and tells him that they have to get going and that the other SWAT guy has been dealt with. And at this point, the protagonist feels like he can trust Neil with the knowledge of Tenet and the inversion technology. The protagonist goes off to find Priya again to get some more answers, and she explains that the thing that he saw at the Oslo freeport was what is called a turnstile, and it's a machine that is yet to be invented. However, in the future it was invented and essentially sent back. Priya explains that they are actually being attacked by the people in the future who are sending back these resources to Sator, as Sator is the key to the plan of the antagonists of the future. So the protagonist, he goes to Italy and he meets up with Kat again, and he convinces her to introduce him as some emissary that she met previously, and she should invite him to their dinner party. Kat is really concerned that Sator will just assume that her and the protagonist are having an affair and just have him killed. But the protagonist explains that, you know what, he can handle himself. Kat goes ahead and asks Sator to invite the protagonist to dinner, and Sator reluctantly agrees, but then he also reveals to Kat that the fake drawing that she gave him, he still has it, and it wasn't actually destroyed in the freeport explosion, and that his power over her is still very well intact. Now we fast forward to dinner, and the protagonist rocks up and sits down next to Sator, and Sator quickly threatens him by saying that he's going to have his men take him out, cut off his balls and shove him down his throat and watch him die. But just as one of Sator's goons comes over to grab the protagonist asks Sator, "Do you like opera?" As Sator was responsible for the opera siege at the very beginning of the film, he realizes that the protagonist isn't just some random that's potentially sleeping with his wife, but someone that actually knows a little bit more than he's letting on. And realizing that he might actually be someone with valuable information completely changes his tune and offers to talk more the next morning. So the next morning, Sator, Kat, and the protagonist go out on this weird three-person date on a catamaran, where Sator questions the protagonist to find out what else he knows. And this whole scene is completely incomprehensible because they're just on the catamaran and the sound of roaring water is just so loud, and there are no subtitles. You don't know what they're saying at all. Kat ends up cutting off Sator's safety harness and he flies off into the water, and she's hoping that he'll drown. But the protagonist ends up jumping in after Sator and rescuing him. Now back on their boat, Kat is questioning the protagonist as to why he saved Sator, explaining that the explosion at the freeport didn't destroy that drawing and that Sator is still able to blackmail her. The protagonist explains that Sator isn't just some simple arms dealer and he's actually involved in something much bigger. And he asks Kat to trust him as he only saved Sator to find out more information. So then Sator and the protagonist go on to have this nice long chat over a glass of vodka, and they end up getting to the point of plutonium, and it seems like that's what Sator is really after. So they discuss that there's going to be this convoy traveling through Tallinn, Estonia, that's going to be carrying this plutonium, and the protagonist offers to assist Sator in acquiring it. Sator is initially apprehensive, but he eventually agrees. Later that night, a helicopter arrives on the yacht and a heavy package is unloaded. The protagonist sneaks around and hides while watching Sator inspect the package. And the package is actually the gold bars, presumably from the 747 crash. Sator then proceeds to beat some guy useless. Anyway, Sator's lead goon finds the protagonist and hits him upside the head and drags him before Sator. Sator oddly doesn't kill the protagonist, but instead just tells him that he's no longer interested in working with him and just sends him on his way. So the protagonist and Neil talk about stealing the plutonium, and they manage to ambush the convoy with the help of some random guys that is not explained where they come from. They wedge the truck containing the plutonium between 4 massive vehicles, essentially trapping it, but also forcing it to keep moving along the highway. The protagonist then climbs up on a fire engine and breaks into the truck and steals this orange case, which supposedly contains the plutonium. The protagonist gets back into the car that Neil is driving, and he opens the case only to find that metal piece that he saw previously at the opera in Kiev. And he tells Neil that he's seen this before and it's absolutely useless. It's definitely not plutonium. But Neil says that it's what Sator is after and he is sure of it. We then see Sator in an oxygen mask in an inverted car as it is reversing, and he's got Kat hostage. And he counts to 3, threatening to kill Kat, and the protagonist ends up throwing the case to Sator. Just as he throws the case to Sator, a silver car comes out of nowhere and flips and crashes. Sator then hops out of that car into another vehicle, leaving Kat tied up in the speeding inverted car. And just before the protagonist jumps into the car, Neil mentions that he needs to call the cavalry. The protagonist manages to jump into the car and press the brake just before that car crashes, saving Kat. But then Sator and his henchmen end up grabbing the protagonist and Kat and abducting them. So they sit the protagonist down on one side of a glass wall with 2 turnstiles at the ends, very similar to the one in Oslo, but much bigger. Sator is on the other side of the glass, threatening to shoot Kat, and when he speaks, his words are backwards, and it's only through some radio that the words are actually translated forwards. Sator on the other side is inverted as he's wearing an oxygen mask, but Kat isn't. And Sator threatens to shoot Kat unless the protagonist tells him exactly where that metal piece is, as he didn't find it in the orange case. The protagonist tells him that he hid it in the glove box of the car that him and Neil were in, but Sator ends up shooting Kat in the stomach anyway. The result of which is that Kat has been shot by an inverted bullet, which, as mentioned previously in the film by Laura, is extremely deadly as the inverted bullet contains massive amounts of radiation. Just as that Sator is about to leave, another Sator appears on the same side as the protagonist and smacks him upside the head and asks him for more information before going into the turnstile. We then get to see Sator's perspective as he goes through the turnstile and becomes inverted. And he goes on to repeat what had previously happened, except this time from his point of view, he's going forwards, but the world around him is inverted. And as soon as Sator leaves, all of a sudden, this whole army just rocks up, led by a character named Ives, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson. And they seem to know a lot about this inversion technology. And I mean a lot. So it did feel like this movie went from, a secret spy mission to now a full-blown military operation. The protagonist really wants to save Kat, and Neil suggests that the only way that Kat is going to stay alive is if she goes through the turnstile and inverts herself, as the effect of the inverted bullet would be reversed and she would be able to heal normally as long as she is inverted. However, it might take a few days of inversion for her to fully recover. But the protagonist doesn't care and he wants them to go through, suggesting that they'll go to Oslo and go back through the turnstile there. Ives and another female operative named Wheeler, Neil, the protagonist, and Kat all go through the turnstile together. And the protagonist says he will chase after Sator to prevent Sator from getting the metal piece from himself. Wheeler explains that the protagonist needs to carry around an oxygen mask, as in the inverted world, breathing is completely different, and without it, he'll die. She also mentions that he can't touch another version of himself or else he'll implode and blink out of existence. So the protagonist goes out into the world and he gets into a silver car and he proceeds to chase after Sator. And now he's inverted, he realizes that he was the one in the car that crashed just as he tossed the case to Sator. An inverted Sator goes to finish the job as he sees the protagonist in the flipped silver car and essentially lights up the gas surrounding the car and waits for it to explode. However, as the protagonist and the car are inverted, the effects of the explosion are not extreme heat, but rather extreme cold. There is a massive time skip and the protagonist wakes up in a shipping container with Neil and Kat, and they're on their way to Oslo, and Neil just simply explains, oh, you know, you got hypothermia, but you didn't actually explode. So this part was all skipped over, and it's not very clear when Neil went to save the protagonist, but we just have to accept that that is what happened. The three of them arrive just outside the freeport, just before, which is technically after, the explosion of the jet. The protagonist suits up in SWAT gear and goes ahead to deal with Sator's men, while Neil and Kat will follow up from behind. As they approach the freeport, a backwards explosion actually sends the protagonist flying through a door, where he finds himself and Neil. And we now realize that the protagonist was that SWAT guy that the protagonist himself was fighting earlier in the film. So now we see the fight all happening in reverse to what we saw previously, with now the protagonist's moves going forward and the previous version of himself, his moves are going in reverse. This fight is just amazing and awesome to see from this completely different perspective. Just seeing the different physics again, all playing out, it is just mesmerizing. The protagonist fights himself and makes it back to the turnstile and inverts back to normal. And now he runs into Neil and has to end up fighting him as well. We then see a scene that we didn't see earlier, in that Neil actually sees the face of the protagonist and lets him go, revealing that Neil actually knew the entire time that they'd be going back to Oslo, but withheld this information from the protagonist. And he later explains this pretty succinctly, because if he were to tell the protagonist that that was what they were going to do, that could potentially influence him to not do it or change his actions in some way, and that would in essence alter everything. Neil and Kat follow shortly after and also invert themselves back, and the three of them escape in an ambulance. So the protagonist once again goes to meet Priya, but as he's gone back in time, this meeting is actually before the previous time he went to see Priya. She explains to him that in the future, there's an Oppenheimer-esque scientist who essentially builds a nuclear warhead in the form of a massive inversion algorithm that would end up inverting the entire world. And she explains that this device consists of 9 pieces, all of which Sator now has his hands on. Priya reveals that she gives the protagonist information to try and stop Sator, even though she understands that it is inevitable that he gets all 9 pieces. And it starts to get a little bit confusing here as to what Priya's involvement is with Tenet. It's unclear which side she actually stands on. Is she on Sator's side or is she on the protagonist's side? But it does seem like to me she's just sort of riding right down the middle. The protagonist also requests that Priya not do anything to Kat, even though she now knows about Tenet and all those loose ends must be tidied. Now this part just gets crazy and is just insane. Neil, Kat, and the protagonist, they discuss how to ultimately stop Sator now that he's got all 9 pieces of the algorithm. They somehow deduce that Sator plans on sending the future the 9 pieces by burying them at his hometown in Russia, the site where Sator initially found the first piece of the algorithm, which was actually sent back by himself. Neil also mentions that Sator has a dead man switch, which means that if he is killed or if he dies, a bomb will go off in a specific spot, which is meant to bury the algorithm deep down somewhere where no one else will find it until the future antagonists can go and dig it up. They have a plan to get Kat to go and distract Sator and prevent him from killing himself while they go and dismantle the pieces. Neil, the protagonist, Ives, and an entire army all head to Russia for this final battle for the pieces of the algorithm, and they collectively perform a temporal pincer. Half the people going forward in normal time and the other half going backwards to support. The final battle is hectic, it's insane, with inverted explosions, with buildings being shot down and rebuilt at the same time. To be honest, it was super overwhelming. I was sort of confused as to what the hell was going on. They even had patches, they had red patches for the people going forward, blue patches for the people going backwards, but I couldn't really even see the bad guys. I was like, what are they even shooting at? They're just shooting at stuff, bombs are coming from everywhere, things are just blowing up. Just so much was going on. to distill it all down, essentially at the very end, the protagonist and Ives, they make it to this center room, this center chamber, where one of Sator's goons, his head goon, is putting the final pieces together and putting it in a time capsule ready to be buried. But they're separated from him by this locked door, and there's this body resting in front of it. They search it for a grenade or some sort of thing that they can use to explode the door open, but they can't find anything. But then just before Sator's goon shoots the protagonist, the body gets up, unlocks the door, but then takes the bullet. And this happens because that person was actually inverted. And that person effectively saves the protagonist's life, and the protagonist goes on to defeat the goon and stop the algorithm from going into the time capsule. However, just before the protagonist stops the goon, Kat goes ahead and kills Sator herself without getting the all clear, claiming that she couldn't bear to let him die, thinking that he'd won. As Sator's dead, the whole chamber starts crumbling as it's trying to bury itself, but Neil comes to the rescue for Ives and the protagonist, and he puts down a cable for Ives and the protagonist to grab a hold of, and as the inner chamber is collapsing, he drags them out. So the three of them did in the end successfully prevent the algorithm from being buried for the people in the future. It is then revealed at the very end by this orange tag on Neil's backpack that Neil is the person who saved the protagonist in the very first scenes of the movie at the opera siege, as he was the one that was inverted that shot the person that caught him out, and also that he was the one at that final gate that took the bullet and unlocked the door for the protagonist to stop Sator's plan from going through. Neil goes off to invert one more time, knowing that he needs to go and unlock the door for the protagonist to fulfill the mission, and we all know that he's actually headed to his doom. Neil then tells the protagonist that it was the protagonist that was the person that recruited him, and that in the future he will actually be the one to establish Tenet. And that although it may be the end of their relationship for Neil, it's only just the beginning of their relationship for the protagonist. The final scene of the entire movie is the protagonist finding and killing Priya just as she's about to knock off Kat, and the film ends with Kat and Max walking off together. I really enjoyed Tenet. I love the high concept styles that Nolan brings to his original films. They make for really great discussion chats after the film, and they really make you think long and hard. And they definitely make you want to watch the film a second time, because you know that after you get all this information and you watch it a second time through, there are going to be all of these details that you missed the first time around. But I do think if we're going to compare this to Inception, I do think Inception was generally a better made film. I will say though that this movie was extremely entertaining. The visuals, the music were just amazing. All the arcs just came full circle and everything was just so well thought out and placed. It was extremely satisfying to see those dots connect. And Robert Pattinson and John David Washington were a really good pairing. They had a really great chemistry. They were so slick and so cool, and they definitely delivered some standout performances. This film has an insane pace. It just keeps going, it keeps pushing, and it doesn't give you a lot of time to breathe. It doesn't give you a lot of time to process what's actually going on. It does feel like a lot of styles and a lot of films all crammed into one movie. You've got a break-in portion, you've got a car chase portion, you've got a heist portion, you've got a military battle portion. There are just so many sequences in this movie that it's just so overwhelming. And yes, I do feel like this film comes off quite confusing. The dialogue being really muffled does not help at all. And I do feel like you could poke a lot of holes in this movie the harder you think about it. And unfortunately, that's just pretty typical for a movie trying to deal with the concept of time. You can just never get it perfect because time is just such an abstract concept to wrap your head around. And the character of Kat, she really got on my nerves a little bit, especially her decision at the end of the film to go ahead and kill Sator without knowing whether or not the world was gonna end. And there were more than just a few instances where you just have to take that leap and you just have to accept certain things. Like the fact that there's a whole cavalry, the fact that there's a whole army that actually knows about Tenet, that just come in towards the final act of the movie. We just have to suddenly accept that they all exist. Like, where were they at the beginning to help out? I don't know. And the fact that they managed to deduce that Sator was going to go back to that specific moment in time in Vietnam where he was having a disagreement with Kat to be the place where he commits suicide to end the world. I mean, that's a very good guess, I guess, but how could they have been certain? Because that moment was so pivotal. And I mean, the whole world's at stake there. They have to be certain that that's the point, right? But they just somehow feel certain based off Kat's comments. At the end, the message I got from this movie really just is whatever happens, happens, and it's already happened. So ultimately, although the protagonist has saved the world, he needs to make sure that he keeps saving the world. And he will, because the world still exists, so he has saved it. And essentially it's mind-boggling because as long as the world's existing, that means the protagonist is saving the world. Yeah, time is just a tricky thing. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you made it to the end, thank you so much. This was such a long video. I'm so sorry for the runtime, but I do really appreciate all the support and I hope that this video was useful to you and cleared some stuff up. So be sure to hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe to Cloudy TV for more content from me. Let me know what you guys thought of Tenet in the comments section down below and let me know what other details that I missed because I'm sure I missed plenty of them. I just wanted to get the general gist out there so that, you know, if people are confused, they could just come here and just have that cleared up. But obviously there's little details, I don't think I've nailed all of them, so I'd definitely love to have a discussion in the comments. I've also seen a theory that Neil is actually Max, Kat's son. And while if it's true, I reckon it's pretty cool, it's pretty neat, it ties everything together even more, but at the same time, I don't think that theory is really that important to the overall story of the film because I don't think it really detracts from the film if it is true or if it's not. It's just like a cool Easter egg. Anyways, I've kept you guys long enough. As always, thank you guys all again, and I'll catch you all next time.